She found him half dead in a raging blizzard, dragged him into her cabin, and nursed him back to life, never knowing that the man she saved was Peter, the Comanche warrior whose name alone made entire settlements flee in terror. And when his tribe came searching for him with war paint and raised weapons, she had to make an impossible choice: betray the man she'd grown to trust or become an enemy to her own people. The winter of 1867 hit the Texas frontier like God's own fury, and Alice Kimball knew she was going to die out here. The blizzard had come without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as midnight and swallowing the trail back to her cabin in a white hell of ice and wind. Her fingers had gone numb inside her leather gloves 2 hours ago, and she couldn't feel her feet anymore, despite the wool socks and sturdy boots her late father had made for her 3 winters past. The basket of wild turkey eggs she'd been collecting had long since been abandoned, lost somewhere in the knee-deep snow behind her. Alice stumbled forward, one hand stretched out before her face to shield against the razor wind, the other clutching her father's old rifle. Not that she could fire it now, even if a bear charged her. Her hands were shaking so badly. She'd been foolish to venture so far from the homestead. But the hens hadn't laid in weeks, and she'd spotted the turkey nest that morning during a brief clear spell. 3 miles out, she'd thought. 3 miles there and back before the weather turned. But the frontier had a way of punishing foolishness, and Alice had learned that lesson in blood and loss more times than she cared to count. First her mother to cholera when she was 12, then her father to a Kiowa raiding party just 2 years ago. And now here she was at 24, alone on 160 acres of frozen hell, about to join them in whatever came after. The wind screamed like a living thing, and through its howling, Alice thought she heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. She stopped, her breath coming in sharp gasps that burned her lungs with cold. There it was again, low and rough, almost like a groan. Alice turned her head, trying to locate the source, and that's when she saw the dark shape half buried in the snowdrift, 20 feet to her left. Her first instinct was to keep moving. Nothing good came from investigating strange shapes in blizzards, and she was already close to freezing herself. But something made her pause. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the memory of her father's voice saying that decent folk don't leave people to die. Or maybe it was just the stubborn streak that had kept her alive this long, when most women would have sold the land and moved back east. Whatever it was, Alice found herself stumbling through the deep snow toward the shape, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she got closer, she could make out details that made her blood run colder than the storm already had. It was a man, face down in the snow, wearing buckskin clothing that was dark with what could only be blood. His long black hair was matted with ice, and one arm was stretched out before him as if he'd been crawling before collapsing. No horse nearby, no supplies, nothing but the man and the snow and the blood. Alice dropped to her knees beside him and rolled him onto his back with effort, her weak hands barely managing the task. His face was the color of old leather, high cheekbones, sharp beneath skin that would have been bronze in warmer days, but now held the grey pallor of approaching death. But it was the markings on his exposed chest, visible where his buckskin shirt had torn open, that made Alice's breath catch in her throat. War paint, faded by snow and blood but still visible, black and red stripes that she recognized from her father's warnings and the terrified whispers of neighbors at the trading post. "Oh, Comanche!" Her hands jerked back from his body as if burned, and she scrambled backward in the snow, her mind screaming at her to run, to leave him, to let the storm finish what it had started. The Comanche were ghosts of the southern plains, raiders who struck without warning and disappeared like smoke, warriors who showed no mercy to settlers who'd taken their hunting grounds. Just last spring, they'd burned the Henderson homestead 15 miles south, killed the father and 2 sons, taken the mother and daughter captive. The territorial militia had found what was left of the men 3 days later, and Alice had heard the screams in her nightmares for months after. But as she stared at the dying man before her, Alice saw something that stopped her flight. His chest was still rising and falling, shallow breaths that came with difficulty, and his eyes were moving beneath closed lids. He was young, she realized, maybe her own age or a few years older, with a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't twisted in pain. And there was so much blood, a deep gash across his ribs that had soaked through his clothing, and what looked like an arrow wound in his left shoulder. The shaft broken off, but the head still embedded in the muscle. Alice Kimball had never been a fool, but she'd also never been cruel. Her father had raised her to see people as people, not just threats or opportunities, and he'd taught her the healing arts that his own mother had learned from a Cherokee woman decades ago. She'd set broken bones, treated fever, pulled bullets from flesh more than once. She knew that leaving this man here was murder, plain and simple, regardless of what tribe he belonged to or what he might have done. "God help me," she whispered into the wind, and made her decision. Getting him back to the cabin nearly killed them both. He was dead weight, unconscious and heavy with muscle despite his lean frame, and Alice had to drag him through the snow, inch by agonizing inch. She looped her arms under his shoulders and pulled, her boots slipping on ice, her breath coming in sobs of effort. The wind fought her every step, and twice she fell, landing hard on the frozen ground with the man's weight pinning her down. But each time she got back up, adjusted her grip and kept pulling. She had no idea how long it took. Time lost meaning in the white chaos of the storm. But eventually, like a miracle, the dark shape of her cabin emerged from the blizzard, the sturdy log walls her father had built, standing firm against the wind. Alice dragged the Comanche warrior up the 2 steps to her door, shoved it open with her shoulder, and pulled him inside before collapsing on the floor beside him, her chest heaving and her vision swimming with black spots. The cabin was barely warmer than outside. The fire in the hearth had died to embers while she'd been gone, and ice had formed on the inside of the windows. But it was shelter, blessed shelter from the killing wind, and Alice knew that shelter was the difference between life and death on a night like this. She forced herself to move, crawling to the hearth on hands and knees, adding kindling from the box her father had built, coaxing the embers back to flame with shaking hands. The fire caught, grew, and warmth began to spread through the small space. Only then did Alice turn her attention back to the man on her floor. He hadn't moved, and for a moment she feared she'd dragged a corpse all this way for nothing. But when she pressed her fingers to his throat, she felt a pulse, weak and irregular, but present. His skin was like ice, and when she pulled open his torn shirt to examine his wounds, she could see that he'd lost far too much blood. The gash across his ribs was deep, probably from a knife or sword, and the arrow wound in his shoulder was inflamed and hot to the touch, despite his body's overall cold. Alice had treated many injuries in her years on the frontier, but never anything quite like this, and never on someone who might wake up and kill her for the presumption. But the work steadied her, gave her hands something to do besides shake with fear. She heated water over the growing fire, gathered her father's medical supplies from the trunk in the corner, whiskey for cleaning, needle and thread for stitching, strips of clean linen for bandaging. She mixed a poultice of yarrow and golden seal for infection, just as her father had taught her. Cutting the arrowhead from his shoulder was the hardest part. Alice had to dig into the swollen flesh with her smallest knife, her stomach turning at each cut, while the unconscious warrior groaned and twitched beneath her hands. When the flint arrowhead finally came free, dark with blood and corruption, she poured whiskey directly into the wound, and he jerked violently, nearly striking her across the face with one flailing arm. She held him down with her weight across his chest until the seizure passed, then stitched the wound closed with quick, practiced movements her hands remembered even if her mind was screaming. The knife wound across his ribs required 32 stitches. Alice counted them as she worked, focusing on the numbers to keep herself calm. 1, 2, 3, pull the thread through, tie it off. 4, 5, 6, his skin is so cold. 7, 8, 9, what am I doing? What have I done? The voice in her head that sounded like her father answered, saving a life, Alice girl, same as I taught you. By the time she'd finished bandaging both wounds and covering him with every blanket she owned, dawn was breaking outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in 3 feet of fresh snow that glittered pink and gold in the rising sun. Alice sat on the floor beside the Comanche warrior, her back against her father's chair, too exhausted to move. She should have been afraid, should have tied him up, should have at least moved the weapons out of his reach. But she couldn't find the energy for fear anymore. She'd done what she'd done, and now she'd face whatever came. The warrior, Petah, though she didn't know his name yet, slept through that first day and into the next night. Alice dozed in fits and starts, jerking awake every time he moved or made a sound, her hand always reaching for the rifle she'd propped against the chair. But he didn't wake, just tossed his head and murmured words in a language she didn't understand, caught in fever dreams that made his muscles twitch and his breathing ragged. On the second morning, his eyes opened. Alice was at the hearth, stirring a thin soup made from the last of her dried venison when she felt his gaze on her back. She froze, the wooden spoon motionless in her hand, then slowly turned to face him. He was watching her with eyes the color of dark amber, focused and aware, despite the fever flush on his cheeks. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Alice's heart was thundering so loud she was sure he could hear it across the small room. Then he spoke, his voice rough as gravel and barely above a whisper. The words were Comanche, incomprehensible to her, but the tone was clear, a question, maybe asking where he was or who she was. Alice licked her dry lips and tried to remember the few Comanche words her father had taught her, trade language picked up from peaceful encounters at the fort. She managed to croak out what she hoped meant safe and friend, though she had no idea if she was saying it right. So, the warrior's eyes narrowed, studying her with an intensity that made her want to flee from her own home. Then his gaze moved past her, taking in the cabin, the hearth with its dancing flames, the shelves lined with her father's books and her mother's dishes, the rifle against the chair, the bearskin rug on the floor. His eyes came back to her face, and she saw the moment he noticed the bandages on his shoulder and ribs, the clean stitching visible at the edges of the linen wrapping. He said something else in Comanche, softer this time, and Alice thought she caught a word that might have meant why or how. She gestured to the door, then to the floor, where she'd first dragged him inside, then to his wounds. She hoped he understood. Storm, found you, brought you here, helped you. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those amber eyes. Not gratitude exactly, but perhaps understanding, or maybe just surprise that she hadn't killed him while he slept. Water, she said, remembering that thirst was always the first need after injury. She picked up the tin cup from beside the hearth and approached him slowly, the way she'd approach a wild animal caught in a trap. He watched every step, his body tensed despite his obvious weakness, and when she knelt beside him to lift his head and bring the cup to his lips, she half expected him to strike her. But he didn't. He drank, the water dribbling down his chin, then fell back against the pillow she'd made from folded blankets, his eyes closing as if that small effort had exhausted him. Over the next 3 days, this existed in a strange, silent truce. Alice tended his wounds, changed his bandages, spooned broth into his mouth when he was strong enough to swallow. He accepted her care with a stoic silence that unnerved her, never speaking except in brief Comanche phrases she couldn't understand, never smiling or showing emotion beyond the occasional wince of pain when she cleaned his injuries. But he didn't try to hurt her either, and gradually she barely noticed it happening. Alice's terror began to fade into something more complex. On the 4th day, he sat up on his own for the first time, his back against the wall, and watched her move around the cabin, doing her daily tasks. Alice tried to ignore his gaze, but she was hyper-aware of every movement she made, reaching for the water bucket, stoking the fire, checking the window for signs of the weather turning. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A foolish white woman who'd saved his life, a potential hostage, an opportunity. That afternoon, while she was mending one of her father's old shirts by the window's light, he spoke in English for the first time. Why? The single word, rough and accented but unmistakably English, made Alice drop the shirt in her lap. She stared at him, mouth slightly open. He was watching her with those unreadable amber eyes, waiting for an answer to a question that contained multitudes. Why did you save me? Why did you bring me here? Why are you helping me? Why haven't you turned me over to the soldiers at the fort? I couldn't leave you to die, Alice said finally, her voice sounding strange in her own ears after days of silence. It wouldn't have been right. He studied her for a long moment, then said something that sounded like a grunt of acknowledgement or perhaps disbelief. Then slowly he raised one hand and touched the bandage on his shoulder, then the one wrapped around his ribs. Good, he said in English. Strong medicine. It wasn't gratitude exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. Alice found herself releasing a breath she hadn't known she was holding. My father taught me, she said. He learned from a Cherokee woman long time ago. He said healing was the same no matter who needed it. The warrior's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something that softened the hard lines of his face. Wise man, he said. Then after a pause, he placed his hand flat against his own chest. Peter. It took Alice a moment to understand that he was telling her his name. Alice, she replied, touching her own chest. Alice Kimball. Alice, he repeated, the syllables strange in his mouth. Then he said something in Comanche that she didn't catch. Before his eyes drifted closed, and he fell back into the healing sleep his body needed. But the ice had been broken, and when he woke again that evening, everything had changed. The next week transformed Alice's cabin from a lonely refuge into something she'd never experienced before, a place of cautious companionship with the most unlikely person imaginable. Peter's strength returned slowly but steadily. By the 5th day after waking, he could stand on his own, though he leaned heavily against the wall and his breathing came hard from the effort. By the 7th day, he was walking short distances across the cabin, testing his injured shoulder with careful rotations that made him grimace, but never cry out. Alice watched his recovery with a mixture of relief and growing apprehension. Each day he grew stronger meant one day closer to when he would leave, and she couldn't decide if that thought brought her comfort or something that felt dangerously close to disappointment. The language barrier between them began to crumble like a riverbank in spring thaw. Peter's English was better than he'd initially let on, learned from traders and treaty talks, though his vocabulary had gaps that led to strange, halting conversations. Alice found herself speaking slowly, choosing simple words and filling the silence with gestures when language failed. He taught her Comanche words in return, not just nouns and verbs, but concepts that had no direct English translation. There was a word for the particular quality of light just before a storm, another for the bond between warriors who'd saved each other's lives, and one for the specific kind of loneliness that came from being the last of something. You live alone, Peter observed one morning while Alice was preparing cornmeal mush for breakfast. He was sitting in her father's chair now, a development that had happened naturally over the past days, and he watched her work with that same intense focus he brought to everything. No husband, no family. Alice's hands paused in their stirring. My father died 2 winters ago, she said quietly. Kiowa raiding party caught him checking the trapline. My mother passed when I was young, cholera, and I never married. She expected him to let the subject drop, but instead he asked, why no husband? You have seen many summers. White women marry young. The observation stung, though she knew he didn't mean it as an insult, just a statement of fact from his perspective. Had a few offers, Alice admitted, turning back to the pot so he wouldn't see the color rising in her cheeks. But they all wanted the land more than they wanted me. 160 acres is worth a lot out here. My father saw through them, sent them packing. After he died, I had more offers, but by then I'd gotten used to making my own choices. Didn't see the point in trading my freedom for a warm body in bed and someone to boss me around. When she glanced back at Peter, she was surprised to see something that might have been approval in his expression. Comanche women choose their husbands, he said. They can divorce them too if the man is lazy or cruel. Keep their children, keep their property. Your white laws are strange, giving everything to the man, making the woman property herself. Alice had never thought about it quite that way, but she couldn't argue with his assessment. She'd seen enough women trapped in miserable marriages, stuck with brutal or worthless husbands because the law and society gave them no way out. Your people sound more sensible than mine on that count, she said, surprising herself with the admission. We are sensible about many things, Peter said, and there was an edge to his voice now, something sharp beneath the calm surface. We lived on these plains for generations before your people came, followed the buffalo, took only what we needed, let the land rest and recover. Then white men came with their fences and their plows, killing buffalo by the thousands just for their hides, leaving the meat to rot, cutting the grass so our horses starve, building their wooden lodges on our hunting grounds, and saying we are the savages for trying to protect what is ours. The sudden passion in his words made Alice set down her spoon and turn to face him fully. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could shatter their fragile peace. But something in her wanted to understand, needed to hear his side of the story that was never told in the settlements. The Henderson family, she said carefully. Last spring. Were you part of that? Peter's expression hardened. I know this Henderson. He and his sons shot my cousin when they found him hunting deer on land that had been ours since our grandfathers' grandfathers walked it. Shot him in the back and left him for the vultures. When our warriors went to seek justice, to take what your people call revenge, the Henderson men fired first. My friends did not start that fight, but they finished it. Alice felt her stomach twist. She'd heard the story differently. Innocent settlers attacked without provocation by savage raiders. But now she was hearing another version, one where the lines between victim and aggressor blurred into something much more complicated. The women, she pressed, Mrs. Henderson and her daughter, they were taken to replace losses, Peter said bluntly. We had lost 3 women to white man's sickness the winter before, the spotted disease your people brought. Taking captives is our way, has been our way long before your people came. Sometimes they are ransomed back. Sometimes they choose to stay, make new lives with us. This is not crueler than what your soldiers do when they attack our villages, killing our grandmothers and our children while the warriors are away hunting. The cornmeal mush was burning. Alice could smell it, but she couldn't seem to move to take it off the fire. Her mind was reeling with too many thoughts, too many conflicting truths. I don't know what to believe, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Believe this, Peter said, leaning forward in the chair despite the obvious pain it cost him. Both our peoples have done terrible things. Both have good reasons, or think they do. But I did not choose this war, Alice. I was born into it, same as you were born into yours. I fight because if I do not fight, my people will disappear like morning fog, and our stories will be forgotten, and the buffalo will all be dead, and there will be nothing left but white man's fences stretching from horizon to horizon. The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a physical presence. Alice turned back to the fire, rescued the mush before it was completely ruined, and served it in silence. They ate without speaking, but the air between them had changed, charged with a new understanding that felt both dangerous and necessary. That afternoon, while Alice was outside splitting firewood, Peter appeared in the doorway, wrapped in one of her father's old coats. He moved carefully, favoring his injured side, but there was determination in his bearing. "Teach me," he said. Alice lowered the axe, breathing hard from exertion. "Teach you what?" "Your father's books." Peter gestured back into the cabin, where her father's small collection sat on the shelf. "I can speak your language, but I cannot read it well. Only a little, learned from missionary at the fort. But if I am to understand white men, I must understand their words on paper, their treaties and their laws that they use like weapons." It was the last thing Alice had expected him to ask for, and she found herself agreeing before she'd fully processed the request. That evening, by the light of the fire, She opened her father's worn copy of Robinson Crusoe and began teaching a Comanche warrior to read English. The lessons became a ritual over the following days. Each afternoon, after Peter had done the exercises Alice prescribed for his healing shoulder, and after she'd completed the never-ending tasks of frontier survival, they would sit together and work through the books. Peter was a quick study, his finger tracing under the words as Alice read them aloud, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sounded out the syllables. When he stumbled, she corrected gently. When he succeeded, she praised him, and occasionally she was rewarded with one of his rare, brief smiles that transformed his entire face. But the lessons went both ways. Peter taught her about the land in ways her father never had, which plants could be eaten in early spring when food was scarce, how to read weather in the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind, where to find water even in drought. He showed her how to move silently through the forest, how to track deer by the subtlest signs, how to start a fire without flint when the conditions were right. Alice absorbed everything hungrily, realizing how much she'd been fumbling through survival on luck and determination rather than real knowledge. "Your father was a good man," Peter said one evening while they were working on a particularly difficult passage about Crusoe's shipwreck. "He taught you healing and shooting and how to see people as people. But he did not teach you how to live on this land. He taught you how to survive against it." Alice looked up from the book. "What's the difference?" "The surviving against the land means you are always fighting the weather, fighting the animals, fighting the earth itself. Living on the land means you are part of it, moving with it instead of against it, taking what you need but giving back. Understanding that you are one small piece of something much larger and older than yourself." It was the most philosophical Peter had ever been with her, and Alice found herself thinking about his words long after they'd closed the book for the night. She'd always thought of the frontier as something to be conquered, tamed, broken to human will. But Peter saw it as something to be understood, respected, lived with rather than dominated. She wasn't sure she could fully adopt his perspective. Her whole world was built on the opposite assumption. But she couldn't dismiss it either. 2 weeks after she'd found him in the blizzard, Peter's wounds had healed enough that he could move without pain, and Alice knew their time together was running short. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, though she tried not to examine too closely why the thought of him leaving bothered her so much. He was Comanche. She was white. They existed on opposite sides of a war neither of them had chosen, but both were trapped within. There was no future where they could be anything to each other beyond what they'd already been, two people who'd briefly found common ground in a world determined to keep them apart. Then, on a cold morning when ice crusted the windows and Alice's breath fogged in the cabin air, everything changed. She'd gone out to check the snare she'd set the previous day, hoping for rabbit or maybe a wild turkey. Peter had offered to come with her, but she'd insisted he rest his shoulder one more day before testing it too strenuously. She'd been gone perhaps an hour when she heard voices coming from the direction of her cabin, multiple voices, speaking English, rough with the accent of men who'd spent too long away from civilization. Alice's blood turned to ice water. She dropped the 2 rabbits she'd caught and ran, her rifle clutched in both hands, her boots slipping on the frozen ground. As she burst through the tree line into the clearing around her cabin, she saw a sight that stopped her heart. 3 men on horseback were circled around her cabin door, and Peter was standing in the doorway, shirtless despite the cold, his wounds clearly visible on his bare chest and shoulder. One of the men had a rifle trained directly on Peter's chest. Another was dismounting a length of rope in his hands. The third was speaking, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen air. "Well, I'll be damned. We've been tracking this red devil for near a week, and here he is holed up in Alice Kimball's cabin, like he owns the place. Miss Kimball's gonna be mighty grateful when we tell her we dealt with the savage that clearly took her captive." "I'm not his captive," Alice shouted, stepping out of the trees with her rifle raised. "And you'll lower your weapons right now, Daniel Morrison." before I put a bullet in that thick skull of yours." The three men wheeled their horses to face her, and Alice recognized them immediately. Daniel Morrison and his two younger brothers, Seth and Joseph, from the settlement 12 miles east. She'd known them since they were boys, though they'd grown hard and mean in the years since the Indian Wars had intensified. Daniel had proposed to her once, right after her father died, and she'd turned him down flat. He'd taken the rejection poorly. "Alice," Daniel said, lowering his rifle slightly but not putting it away, "thank God you're alive. We've been tracking this Comanche raider since he killed Pete Henderson's hired hand last month. Figured the storm had killed him, but seems he found your place instead. Don't worry, we'll take care of him for you." "You'll do no such thing," Alice said, moving to stand between the Morrison brothers and her cabin door, where Peter remained motionless and watchful. "He's under my protection. He's done nothing to me or mine." Daniel's expression darkened. "He's Comanche, Alice. That's all he needs to have done. You know what they did to the Hendersons. Hell, this might be one of the savages who did it. We got us a bounty on Comanche warriors, $5 a scalp, more if they're known raiders. This one's got war paint scars and everything. He's worth maybe $20 to us." $20. The casual way Daniel said it, as if Peter were nothing more than a particularly valuable animal hide, made rage rise hot in Alice's throat. "He saved my life during the blizzard," she lied smoothly. "Helped me get back to the cabin when I'd gotten turned around in the storm. I'm repaying the debt by helping him heal from wounds he got defending against white raiders who attacked his hunting party. You lay one hand on him, and I'll shoot you, Daniel Morrison." "Don't think I won't." The three brothers exchanged glances. Seth, the youngest at maybe 19, spoke up nervously. "Daniel, maybe we should just let it be. Alice Kimball's not someone to cross, and her pa taught her to shoot straight as any man. If she says this Indian's under her protection—" "Shut up, Seth," Daniel snapped. Then to Alice, "You're protecting a Comanche warrior. Do you understand what that makes you? A traitor to your own people. When word gets back to the fort, to the settlement, they'll run you off this land faster than you can blink. Might even hang you as a Comanche sympathizer." Alice's hands were shaking on the rifle, but her voice came out steady. "Then I guess you better not spread that word, hadn't you? Because if you do, I'll tell everyone how you three spent last winter rustling cattle from the army's herd and selling them to that crooked trader in El Paso. I got proof too. My father saw you doing it, wrote it all down in his journal. That's a hanging offense, Daniel. Murder of a man under someone's protection is too. So we've got ourselves what I believe they call a stalemate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." It was a bluff. Her father had written no such thing. Though he'd suspected the Morrison brothers of rustling and had told Alice as much before he died, but Daniel didn't know that, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. After a long, tense moment, he spat into the snow and jerked his horse's head around. "Fine," he said, "but this isn't over, Alice. That savage leaves your property. He's fair game. And you better hope word doesn't get out about this anyway, because there's plenty of folks who'd burn this cabin down around your ears for what you're doing here." The Morrison brothers rode off, their horses kicking up sprays of snow, and Alice stood watching them go until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did she lower her rifle, and only then did she realize she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. She turned back to the cabin, where Peter still stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You should have let them take me," he said quietly. "What you have done, it will bring you trouble." "Yeah, well," Alice said, brushing past him into the cabin and setting her rifle down with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "Seems like Trouble and I are old friends by now. Besides, I meant what I told them. You saved my life in a way. Gave me someone to care for, someone to talk to. This winter would have been a lot lonelier without you here." Peter was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped fully into the cabin and closed the door against the cold. When Alice finally turned to look at him, she was startled by the intensity in his amber eyes. "Among my people," he said slowly, "when someone saves your life, a bond is created. You become responsible for that person, and they for you. It is not a debt that can be repaid with simple gratitude. It is a connection that lasts." "What are you saying?" Alice asked, though her heart was suddenly beating very fast. "I am saying that you saved my life first in the storm, and now you have saved it again from those men. By Comanche law, by the laws I was raised with, that makes you my responsibility, my bond sister, if you would accept it. And it means that when my people come looking for me, and they will come, Alice, I will stand between you and them, just as you stood between me and those white men." The weight of what he was offering settled over Alice like a heavy blanket. She thought about the Morrison brothers and their threats, about the danger she'd just put herself in, about the impossible situation she'd created by choosing to save a Comanche warrior's life, and then defending him against her own people. And then she thought about the past 2 weeks, the quiet companionship, the shared meals, the reading lessons and the tracking lessons. The way Peter had looked at her when she'd stepped between him and those rifles without hesitation. "I accept," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. "Bond sister, if that's what you want to call it." Peter's expression softened into something that might have been relief. He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, the same gesture she'd seen him make when testing his own healing wounds. But this time it felt ceremonial, weighted with meaning. "Then we are bound," he said. "And when my people come, you will see that not all Comanche are raiders and killers. You will see who we really are if you have the courage to look." Alice placed her own hand on his shoulder, mirroring his gesture, feeling the warmth of his skin and the solidity of muscle and bone beneath her palm. "I'm looking," she said quietly. "I've been looking since the day I found you in that storm. And what I see doesn't match what I was told to expect." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the cabin's shutters and moaning through the trees. But inside, something had shifted, transformed, become something neither of them had quite expected when Alice had made the choice to drag a dying man out of a blizzard. They were no longer simply a white woman and a Comanche warrior trapped together by circumstance. They were something new, something that had no name in either of their languages, but felt as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet. And when Peter's people finally came 3 days later, riding out of the dawn with painted faces and weapons raised, Alice Kimball stood beside him on her cabin's porch without flinching, ready to face whatever came next. The Comanche war party arrived with the rising sun, 7 warriors on painted horses that moved like flowing water across the snow-covered plains. And Alice's first thought was that she was about to die. She'd been up since before dawn, unable to sleep after Peter had woken her with a hand on her shoulder and 3 quiet words, "They are coming." He'd known somehow. Maybe he'd heard something her ears couldn't catch. Or maybe it was just instinct honed by a lifetime of warfare and survival. Whatever the reason, he'd been right. Now they stood together on her cabin's narrow porch. Alice still in her nightdress with her father's coat thrown over it, and Peter shirtless, despite the freezing air, his healing wounds on full display as the warriors approached. The leader rode at the front on a massive black stallion, his face painted in stark lines of red and black, a lance decorated with feathers and what looked like human hair gripped in one hand. He was older than Peter, maybe 40 summers, with scars crossing his chest and arms that spoke of countless battles survived. His eyes, hard as flint, fixed on Peter first and then slid to Alice with an expression that made her blood freeze. He spoke in rapid Comanche, his voice carrying the weight of command and barely controlled fury. Peter answered in the same language, his tone respectful but firm. And Alice caught her own name in the flowing syllables, Alice, pronounced with the same careful emphasis Peter always used. The leader's eyes snapped back to her, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back into the cabin. But she held her ground, kept her chin up, and met his gaze without flinching, even though her heart was hammering so hard she felt dizzy. The exchange went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The other warriors sat motionless on their horses, weapons ready but not raised, their painted faces revealing nothing. Elis understood none of the words, but she could read the tension in every line of Peter's body, the careful way he positioned himself slightly in front of her, the deliberate calmness of his gestures as he spoke. He was negotiating something, she realized, arguing for something, and she was pretty sure that something was her life. Finally, the leader made a sharp cutting gesture with his free hand and spoke what sounded like a command. Peter stiffened, then turned to Alice with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something that looked almost like fear. "Though not for himself, Takoda wishes to speak with you," Peter said quietly in English. "He is the war chief of our band and my uncle, my mother's brother. He says you have bewitched me, made me forget who I am and who my people are. He wants to know why he should not kill you now and burn your wooden lodge for harboring an enemy of the Comanche." Alice's mouth went dry as creekbed in August. "What did you tell him?" "Oh, I told him you saved my life when you could have left me to die. I told him you are under my protection, that we are bound by laws older than the white man's fences. I told him you have shown more courage and honor than most warriors I have known." Peter paused, his amber eyes searching her face. "But he does not believe me. He thinks you have made me weak, turned me into something shameful. He wants to hear from your own mouth why he should spare you." Alice looked past Peter to Takoda, who sat waiting on his black stallion with the patience of a man who knew he held all the power in this moment. 7 warriors against 1 woman and 1 injured man. There was no question of how this would end if it came to violence. But Alice Kimball hadn't survived this long on the frontier by giving in to fear. Her father had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. "Tell him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that I saved Peter because it was the right thing to do. Tell him that I don't see Comanche or white when I see a man dying in the snow. I just see someone who needs help. Tell him that Peter has been nothing but honorable under my roof, and that he's taught me more about living on this land in 2 weeks than I learned in 24 years before he came. And tell him that if he's going to kill me for that, then he'd better do it quick, because I don't intend to beg." Peter translated her words, and Alice watched Takoda's face as he listened. Something flickered in those hard eyes, surprise maybe, or grudging respect, or perhaps just amusement at her audacity. When Peter finished speaking, Takoda responded with a long speech that made 2 of the younger warriors shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "He says," Peter translated, his voice tight, "that you speak bold words for a woman alone, with no man to protect her, and no tribe to avenge her death. He says the white settlers have taken much from our people, our hunting grounds, our buffalo, our freedom to live as we have always lived. He says every cabin built on our land is an act of war, every fence an insult, every white child born here a theft of our children's future. He asks why he should not add your scalp to the others he has taken, why your death would not be justice for all the Comanche who have died at white men's hands." The words hit Alice like physical blows, each one carrying a truth she couldn't deny, even as it terrified her. She thought about the Henderson family, about all the stories she'd heard of Comanche raids and white settlements burned. But she also thought about Peter's words from days before, about his cousin shot in the back while hunting, about villages attacked while warriors were away, about a war neither side had chosen, but both were trapped within. "Tell him," Alice said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that he's right. White settlers have taken much from his people, more than I even knew until Peter told me. Tell him I can't give back what's been stolen, can't undo what's been done. But tell him that killing me won't bring back the dead or restore what's lost. It'll just be one more death in a war that's already claimed too many on both sides." She paused, then added, "And tell him that Peter is alive, because I chose mercy over vengeance. Maybe he could consider doing the same. Peter's eyes widened slightly at that last part, but he translated faithfully. The words seemed to hang in the frozen air, visible as breath fog in the morning cold. Dakota sat motionless for a long moment, then did something Alice never expected. He laughed, a harsh bark of sound that held no humor but maybe something like acknowledgement. He spoke again, shorter this time, and Peter's shoulders relaxed fractionally. He says you have more spine than most white men he's killed, and that it would be a waste to kill someone with such strong spirit. He says you may live, but there are conditions. What conditions? Alice asked, though she was pretty sure she'd agree to almost anything that didn't involve dying in the next few minutes. You must come with us, Peter said, and now his voice held something that might have been apology. Back to our winter camp. Dakota says, if you truly saved my life, and if I truly believe you are different from other white settlers, then you should be willing to live among us for a time. To see how we live, to understand what your people are destroying. He says, if you survive one full moon cycle in our camp without trying to escape or betraying us, you will be free to return to your wooden lodge, and we will leave you in peace. You will become Tebobavi, white friend, and no Comanche warrior will raise a hand against you or what is yours. Alice felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Leave her cabin, travel to a Comanche camp, live among people who had every reason to hate her, trust her life to the mercy of warriors who'd been painted as monsters in every story she'd ever heard. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only way she'd survive to see another sunrise. And if I refuse? She made herself ask. Peter didn't need to translate that question to Dakota. Then I cannot protect you, he said quietly. Bond sister or not, I am one man against 7, and I am still healing. Dakota will kill you where you stand, and there is nothing I can do to stop it that would not mean my own death and the deaths of my friends. Please, Alice, trust me, come with us. I will keep you safe. Alice looked into Peter's amber eyes and saw genuine fear there, not for himself, but for her. She thought about her cabin, her father's books, the land she'd fought so hard to keep. She thought about what would happen if the Morrison brothers spread word that she'd been harboring a Comanche warrior, about the mob that might come to burn her out anyway. At least, with Dakota's offer, she had a chance. A slim one, maybe, but a chance nonetheless. 1 month, she said firmly. 1 full moon. And then I come back here to my home, and your people leave me be. Peter translated, and Dakota nodded once, sharp and decisive. He spoke again, gesturing to one of the younger warriors, who dismounted and approached the cabin door. Alice tensed, but Peter put a hand on her arm. He will help you gather what you need for travel. Warm clothes, blankets. You cannot bring your rifle. Dakota will not allow that. But you can bring other things. Be quick. We ride within the hour. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity. Alice dressed in her warmest clothing. Wool trousers that had been her father's, 2 shirts layered under a thick coat, her sturdiest boots. She packed a bag with extra clothes, her father's journal, though she couldn't say why, a tinder box, and the small carved wooden horse her father had made for her when she was 6. The young warrior who'd come to help, barely more than a boy, really, with kind eyes despite his war paint, watched everything she did, but made no move to stop her or search through her belongings. Peter dressed in the buckskin clothing Alice had cleaned and repaired during his recovery, moving carefully to avoid pulling his healing wounds. He looked different in his own clothes, not softer exactly, but more himself, like he'd been wearing a costume during his time in her cabin and was now stepping back into his real skin. When he caught her watching him, he offered a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I will not let them hurt you, he said quietly, while the young warrior was distracted examining Alice's father's books with curious fingers. You have my word, Alice. My life for yours if it comes to that. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Alice replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. I've gotten kind of used to having you around. Would be a shame to lose you now. Something warm flickered in Peter's expression, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. Then Dakota was calling from outside, and there was no more time for words. They gave her a horse, a gentle-eyed mare with a thick winter coat, and Alice was grateful she'd learned to ride as a girl, even if it had been years since she'd done more than ride old Bessie the plough horse around the property. The Comanche warriors mounted with fluid grace that spoke of lives lived on horseback, and Alice did her best not to look clumsy as she settled into the saddle. Petar rode beside her, close enough that their knees almost touched, while Dakota took the lead and the other warriors formed a loose circle around them. As they rode away from her cabin, Alice turned in her saddle for one last look. The little log structure her father had built with his own hands sat quiet in the snow, smoke still rising from the chimney where she'd banked the fire before leaving. It looked small and vulnerable from this distance, and Alice felt a sharp pain in her chest at the thought that she might never see it again. Despite Dakota's promise, despite Petar's reassurances, she was riding off into the wilderness with 7 Comanche warriors who had every reason to kill her, and no one would ever know what happened to her. "Do not look back," Petar said softly beside her. "In Comanche way, looking back brings bad medicine. Look forward. Trust in what comes." Alice forced herself to turn forward, to focus on the path ahead. The warriors set a punishing pace despite the snow, their horses moving with sure-footed confidence across terrain that looked identical to Alice's untrained eyes. They rode for hours without stopping, the sun climbing to its zenith and then beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Alice's legs ached from gripping the saddle. Her face burned with cold despite her wool scarf, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. But none of the warriors showed any sign of discomfort, so she gritted her teeth and kept riding. It was late afternoon when they finally stopped beside a frozen creek bed. The warriors dismounted and immediately set about making camp with practiced efficiency, gathering deadwood for a fire, tending to the horses, pulling strips of dried meat and pemmican from their saddlebags. Alice slid from her horse with shaking legs and nearly fell, catching herself at the last moment. Petar was there instantly, his hand under her elbow, steadying her. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than I expected for someone not raised to ride long distances. Come, sit by the fire, eat something. Tomorrow will be easier." Alice doubted that very much, but she accepted the dried meat he offered and chewed it mechanically, too tired to taste it. The other warriors mostly ignored her, talking among themselves in rapid Comanche while they worked. But she caught them glancing her way occasionally, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to what might have been grudging respect. The young warrior who'd helped her pack approached the fire and offered her a water skin with a shy smile that transformed his painted face into something almost boyish. "Kohana," he said, touching his chest. Then he pointed at her. "Alice, Alice," she corrected gently, then pointed at him. "Kohana." She tried to pronounce it the way he had, and his smile widened when she got it mostly right. Dakota barked something that made Kohana jump back from the fire, but not before Alice caught a glimpse of kindness in the young warrior's eyes. "Not all of them hate me," she thought. "Maybe not even most of them. They're just doing what they think they have to do, same as I am." That night, sleeping under the stars with only a thin blanket and the warmth of the fire between her and the freezing darkness, Alice dreamed of her father. He was standing in the doorway of their cabin, looking out at the plains, with an expression she couldn't read. When she called to him, he turned and smiled, the same gentle, understanding smile he'd given her so many times when she was young and confused about the world. "You're doing fine, Alice girl," he said in the dream, his voice as clear as if he were really there. "Walking the path between two worlds is never easy, but you got the strength for it. You got your mother's heart and my stubborn streak, and that's a powerful combination. Just remember, people are people no matter what side of the fence they're born on. You see that now? Don't forget it." She woke before dawn to find Petar sitting nearby, keeping watch while the others slept. When he saw her eyes open, he moved closer and spoke in a whisper that wouldn't wake the camp. "3 more days to reach our winter camp," he said. "Dakota is taking us the long way, testing you, I think. seeing if you will complain or try to escape. Do neither, and you will earn his respect. He is hard, but he is fair, and his word is law among our people." "What happens when we get there?" Alice asked, equally quiet. "What should I expect?" Peter was silent for a moment, and in the pre-dawn darkness she couldn't read his expression. "Curiosity," he said finally. "Fear, anger. My people have lost much to white settlers, and you will be a living reminder of everything they hate and fear. But you will also be under my protection, and I am not without standing among our band. My father was a great chief before he was killed by Texas Rangers 5 years ago. My mother is sister to Dakota. My younger sister is married to our best scout. I have friends who will speak for me and through me for you." "You never mentioned family before," Alice said, surprised by this revelation. "You never asked," Peter replied simply. "And in your cabin, that part of my life felt very far away, like something from a different world." He paused, then added softly, "But now both worlds are coming together, and I do not know what that will mean. For you, for me, for either of our peoples. All I know is that you saved my life, Alice Kimball, and I will not forget that. Whatever comes, you will not face it alone." The promise hung in the cold air between them, as real and solid as a sworn oath. And Alice felt some of the fear that had gripped her since Dakota's war party arrived begin to loosen its hold. She was riding into unknown danger with people who had every reason to mistrust her, leaving behind everything familiar and safe. But she wasn't doing it alone. She had Peter, had his protection and his friendship, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. They rode on through landscapes that took Alice's breath away despite her exhaustion and fear. Vast plains that rolled like frozen ocean waves. Canyons carved by ancient waters. Forests of pine and juniper that whispered in the winter wind. The warriors moved through this terrain like they were part of it, reading signs Alice couldn't see, finding paths where there seemed to be none. She watched and learned, storing away everything she observed, and slowly began to understand what Peter had meant about living on the land, instead of fighting against it. On the third day, they crested a rise, and Alice saw the Comanche winter camp spread out in the valley below, dozens of buffalo-hide teepees arranged in careful patterns, smoke rising from cook fires, horses grazing in a makeshift corral, and people, so many people, moving between the teepees, going about their daily lives. Children ran and played despite the cold. Women worked at various tasks, and warriors sat in groups talking or working on weapons and equipment. It looked nothing like the savage war camps Alice had imagined based on the stories she'd heard in the settlements. It looked like a community, like a town, like people living their lives the best way they knew how, in a world that was trying to destroy them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Dakota raised his lance and gave a ululating cry that echoed across the valley. The sound made Alice's heart jump into her throat, but she held steady on her horse. All through the camp, people stopped what they were doing and turned to look up at the war party on the ridge. And then, as Dakota led them down into the valley, Alice Kimball rode into the Comanche camp and toward whatever fate awaited her there. The hatred hit Alice like a physical force the moment they rode into camp, radiating from the eyes of every person who stopped to stare at the white woman among the returning warriors. Children who'd been laughing and playing fell silent, some running to hide behind their mothers' skirts, while others simply stood and gawked with wide, frightened eyes. Women straightened from their work at the cook fires, their expressions hardening from curiosity to cold hostility in the space of a heartbeat. A group of young warriors who'd been practicing with bows turned as one to watch the procession, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons, even though Dakota had clearly brought her here under some kind of protection. The weight of all those eyes, all that mistrust and barely contained violence, made Alice want to turn her horse around and flee back across the plains. Consequences be damned, but Peter rode beside her with his head high, speaking in calm, carrying tones to people they passed. And though Alice couldn't understand his words, she recognized the cadence of explanation, of reassurance. Some faces softened at whatever he said. Others remained stone-hard, unmoved by his arguments. An elderly woman with hair as white as the snow on the distant peaks spat deliberately as they passed, and a young mother pulled her child away, as if Alice carried some contagious disease. Takoda led them to the largest teepee in the camp, positioned at what Alice guessed was the center of the settlement. He dismounted with fluid grace and spoke a few sharp words that sent Kahana and 2 other young warriors hurrying off to tend the horses. Then he turned to Alice, still mounted on her borrowed mare, and gestured for her to dismount. Peter slid from his horse first and moved to help her down, his hands steadying her when her stiff legs nearly buckled beneath her. The flap of the large tipi opened, and a woman emerged who could only be Takoda's wife, tall and regal, with silver threaded through her long black hair and eyes that assessed Alice with the kind of cold intelligence that missed nothing. She wore a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork and quillwork that must have taken months to complete, and when she spoke to Takoda, her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Takoda responded respectfully, gesturing toward Alice and then Peter, and the woman's gaze sharpened as she studied them both. "This is Nakai," Peter said quietly to Alice, "Takoda's wife and a woman of great standing in our band. She will decide where you sleep and what work you will do. Show her respect, but do not grovel. She has no patience for weakness." Before Alice could respond, a younger woman emerged from a nearby teepee and let out a cry that could only be joy. She ran toward them, her long braids flying, and threw herself at Peter with enough force to make him stagger back despite his size. She was speaking rapid Comanche, punctuated with what sounded like scolding, her hands running over his shoulders and chest as if checking for injuries, tears streaming down her face. "My sister," Peter said to Alice, with the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face since the war party had arrived at her cabin. "Ayana, she thought I was dead." He caught his sister's hands and spoke to her gently. Gesturing toward Alice, Ayana's tear-streaked face turned toward Alice, and for a moment there was such naked hostility in her expression that Alice took an involuntary step backward. But then Peter said something else, something urgent and pleading, and Ayana's expression shifted to confusion, then to something that might have been reluctant acceptance. The reunion was cut short by Nakai's sharp command. She gestured for Alice to follow her, not waiting to see if the white woman would obey. Alice glanced at Peter, who nodded encouragingly, and then forced her exhausted legs to carry her after Takoda's formidable wife. They passed between rows of teepees, drawing stares and whispers everywhere they went, until they reached a smaller shelter near the edge of the camp. Nakai ducked inside and Alice followed, grateful to be out of the hostile gazes for a moment. The interior of the teepee was surprisingly warm, despite the winter cold outside, heated by a small fire in the center and insulated by the thick buffalo hides that formed the walls. Nakai gestured for Alice to sit, then settled herself across the fire with the kind of perfect posture that made Alice suddenly aware of her own slouched shoulders and trail-worn appearance. For a long moment, the older woman simply studied her in silence, and Alice forced herself to meet that penetrating gaze without flinching. When Nakai finally spoke, it was in slow, careful English that shocked Alice into a visible reaction. "You understand me?" Nakai asked, and there was something that might have been amusement in her dark eyes at Alice's surprise. "Yes," Alice managed. "I didn't know you spoke English." "Many things white people do not know about Comanche," Nakai said with a slight smile that held no warmth. "This is one. I learned your tongue from missionary woman many winters ago, when I was young and foolish enough to think white people in Comanche could live in peace. I learned different, but the words stayed." She paused, her gaze never leaving Alice's face. "Peter says you saved his life. Dakota says you stood between him and white men with rifles. This is true?" "Yes," Alice said simply, seeing no point in elaborating. "Why?" The question was blunt, demanding. White settlers want all Comanche dead. Want our land, our hunting grounds, our freedom gone. You are white. He is Comanche. Why save him? Alice had asked herself the same question 100 times since that day in the blizzard, and she still wasn't entirely sure of the answer. Because he was dying and I could help, she said finally. Because my father taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or which side of a war they were born on. Because it was the right thing to do. Nakai was silent for a long moment, and Alice couldn't read her expression. Then the older woman reached into a parfleche bag beside her and pulled out a bundle of dried meat and pemmican. She handed it to Alice without ceremony. Eat, she commanded. You look like skeleton. Cannot work if you are weak from hunger. As Alice accepted the food with shaking hands and began to eat, Nakai continued, You will stay here, in this lodge. It belonged to young warrior who died last summer in fight with Texas Rangers. No family left to claim it. You will work with the women, tanning hides, gathering firewood, cooking, whatever is needed. You will learn our ways. If you try to escape, you will be killed. If you try to harm anyone in this camp, you will be killed. If you bring soldiers here, everyone you have met will be killed, including Peta. You understand? I understand, Alice said around a mouthful of pemmican. I gave my word to Dakota, 1 month, 1 full moon. I'll stay, I'll work, I'll cause no trouble. And then I go home. Something flickered in Nakai's eyes at that. Maybe, she said cryptically, maybe you go home. Or maybe you learn that home is not always place you were born. We will see. Before Alice could ask what she meant by that, Nakai stood in one fluid movement despite her years. Rest now. Tomorrow work begins. And Al-Is, she pronounced the name the same way Peta did. Do not expect kindness from our women. They have lost husbands, sons, fathers to white men's bullets. You are alive when their loved ones are dead. They will resent this. But if you work hard and show respect, they will not harm you. This is Dakota's word, and his word is law. Then she was gone, leaving Alice alone in the teepee with a fire that was already burning low and exhaustion that hit her like a falling tree. She barely managed to add more wood to the fire before collapsing onto the pile of buffalo robes that served as a bed, and sleep claimed her instantly. She woke to someone shaking her shoulder roughly in the pre-dawn darkness. Alice jerked upright, disoriented, and reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, to find a young Comanche woman standing over her with an expression of pure contempt. The woman said something sharp in Comanche, then turned and walked out of the tipi, clearly expecting Alice to follow. Alice scrambled into her clothes and boots and hurried after her, emerging into a camp that was already awake and bustling with activity despite the early hour. See, the young woman, Alice guessed she was maybe 18 or 19, led her to where a group of women were working around a large fire, scraping the flesh and fat from stretched buffalo hides with stone tools. The work looked backbreaking, and the smell was overwhelming even in the cold air. The young woman thrust a scraping tool at Alice and gestured at an untreated hide stretched on a wooden frame, her meaning clear. Alice took the tool and approached the hide, aware of every woman's eyes on her as she positioned herself and began to scrape. Within minutes, her hands were cramping and her shoulders burning with effort. The Comanche women made the work look easy, their practiced motions efficient and steady, but Alice's strokes were clumsy and ineffective. She could feel their judgment with every awkward movement she made. One older woman said something that made the others laugh, not friendly laughter, but the cruel kind that needs no translation. Alice's face burned, but she kept working, kept scraping, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her quit. An hour passed, then 2. Alice's hands blistered and bled, despite the leather gloves someone had grudgingly provided. Her back screamed in agony from the unfamiliar position, but she didn't stop. Didn't complain, didn't even look up from her work, except to occasionally check what the other women were doing, so she could try to improve her technique. Slowly, grudgingly, she began to figure out the right angle, the right pressure, the rhythm of the work. Her hide would never be as cleanly scraped as the ones the experienced women produced, but it was getting better. Around midday, Ayana appeared with a basket of food, dried meat, pemmican, and something that looked like flatbread. She distributed it to the working women, who accepted it with nods of thanks, speaking to her with warmth that contrasted sharply with their cold treatment of Alice. When Ayana reached Alice, she hesitated, her face conflicted before setting down a small portion of food and water. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Alice saw the struggle there. Peter's sister, torn between loyalty to her brother and her own feelings about having a white woman in their camp. "Thank you," Alice said quietly, and though Ayana didn't respond, something in her expression softened fractionally before she moved on. The afternoon brought different work, gathering firewood from the surrounding area under the watchful eye of two young warriors who made it clear they were there to prevent escape, not to help. Alice hauled wood until her arms felt like they'd tear from her shoulders, making trip after trip from the forest to the camp while the warriors sat on their horses and watched with expressions ranging from boredom to amusement at her struggles. When she finally stumbled on the uneven ground and fell, dropping her entire load of carefully gathered wood, one of the warriors laughed outright. Alice picked herself up, gathered the scattered wood, and kept going. That night, she collapsed in her borrowed teepee with barely enough energy to eat the small portion of food someone had left outside her door. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her hands were raw despite the gloves, and she was pretty sure she'd never been this tired in her entire life. But she'd survived day one. 29 more to go. The days began to blur together into an endless cycle of brutal labor and cold shoulders. Alice scraped hides until her hands were permanently stained and calloused. She hauled water from the frozen creek until her shoulders felt permanently hunched. She learned to tan leather, using a mixture of brains and liver that made her stomach turn. She gathered wood, tended fires, stirred cooking pots, and performed 100 other tasks that the Comanche women assigned her with expressions that ranged from contempt to grudging acceptance. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. On the 5th day, when Alice was struggling with a particularly tough hide, one of the older women, the same one who'd laughed at her that first day, grunted and adjusted Alice's grip on the scraping tool, showing her a better technique without a word of explanation. On the 8th day, a middle-aged woman whose name Alice had learned was Mappy offered her a pair of better gloves, worn but serviceable, with a gruff comment in Comanche that Kahana later translated as "cannot work if hands fall off." On the 12th day, when Alice managed to properly flesh a hide in half the time it had taken her the week before, several of the women nodded in what might have been approval. Petar visited her teepee most evenings, bringing food and checking on her welfare with a concern that warmed Alice despite her exhaustion. He taught her more Comanche words and phrases, helped her understand the complex social structures of the band, explained customs and traditions that would have gotten her killed through ignorance. Through him, Alice learned that the young woman who'd woken her so roughly that first morning had lost her husband to a cavalry attack just 3 months ago, that the older woman who'd laughed at her had lost 2 sons in the same fight, that nearly every person in this camp had lost someone to the war with white settlers, and their hatred was born not of inherent cruelty, but of grief so deep it had no bottom. "They test you," Peter explained one evening while they sat by her fire sharing a meal. "Push you to see if you will break, if you will run, if you will show the weakness they expect from white women. But you do not break. This they respect. Not all, not yet, but some." "What about you?" Alice asked, studying his face in the firelight. "How are you being treated? Because you brought me here? Because you're protecting me?" Peter's expression grew shadowed. "Some question my judgment. Say I have become too sympathetic to white ways, that I have forgotten who I am. My sister worries that I bring danger to our people by allowing you to see our camp, learn our ways." Even Takoda watches me closely, wondering if I have been weakened by my time in your wooden lodge." He paused, then met her eyes. "But I do not regret my choice, Alice. You saved my life. That debt cannot be dismissed because others are uncomfortable." The honesty in his voice made Alice's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I'm causing you trouble," she said quietly, "with your own people. Maybe I should—" "You should stay," Peter interrupted firmly. "You should finish what you started. Already you have shown some of our women that white people are not all the same, that courage and honor are not limited to Comanche. This is important, even if the change is small and slow." On the 15th day, halfway through her promised month, something happened that changed everything. Alice was working with a group of women processing a deer that hunters had brought. In that morning, when a commotion erupted at the edge of camp, warriors mounted their horses with weapons ready, and women began hurrying children into teepees. Through the sudden chaos, Alice saw riders approaching. White men, maybe a dozen of them, and leading them was a face she recognized with a sinking heart. Daniel Morrison, flanked by his brothers and what looked like a hastily assembled militia from the surrounding settlements, rode up to the camp perimeter with rifles drawn and faces set in grim determination. Takoda and his warriors formed a line between the white men and the camp, weapons raised but not yet striking. The tension was thick enough to choke on, and Alice felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. This was it, the confrontation she'd been dreading, the moment when her two worlds collided with potentially deadly consequences. Daniel's voice carried across the space between the two groups, loud and aggressive. "We know you've got Alice Kimball in there. We tracked her from her cabin. You send her out now, or we're coming in to get her, and we don't care how many of you red devils we have to kill to do it." Before anyone could stop her, before she even fully thought about what she was doing, Alice pushed through the line of Comanche women and walked toward the confrontation. Behind her she heard Peter shout her name, heard running footsteps, but she didn't stop. She walked straight through the line of Comanche warriors. Takoda's hand shot out to grab her but missed, and kept walking until she stood in the open. Space between the two groups, visible to everyone. "I'm here, Daniel," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm alive and well, and I'm here of my own free will. Nobody's holding me captive. Now turn around and go home, before you start a fight that'll get a lot of good people killed for no reason." Daniel's face contorted with confusion, then anger. "Your own free will? Alice, have they hurt you? Made you say that? These are Comanche raiders, murderers and thieves. We're here to rescue you." "I don't need rescuing," Alice said firmly, and as she spoke she became aware of Peter moving to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "These people took me in, gave me shelter, treated me fairly. Better than you did when you tried to collect bounty on a man I was protecting. You need to leave, Daniel. Now, before this turns into a massacre." The moment hung suspended, balanced on a knife's edge between peace and violence. Daniel's men shifted nervously, looking at each other, clearly not expecting to find Alice Kimball standing between them and their targets, defending the very people they'd come to attack. Behind her, Alice could feel the confusion and tension radiating from the Comanche warriors, who couldn't fully understand the English being spoken, but could read the confrontation clearly enough. Then Takoda did something that shocked everyone present. He rode forward slowly, stopping beside Alice and Peter, and spoke in carefully enunciated English, rough and accented but comprehensible. "White woman speaks truth. She is guest. Under protection. You go now. Come back. We fight. You die. Choose." The simple, brutal directness of the statement seemed to penetrate where Alice's words had not. Daniel looked at her one more time, his expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been hurt pride. Then he jerked his horse's head around and growled, "This isn't over, Alice. You're making a mistake you'll regret. But he rode away, and his men followed, and the immediate crisis passed. Alice stood there shaking, not quite believing what had just happened, what she'd just done. She'd put herself between two armed groups who hated each other, had vouched for people who most whites considered monsters, had quite possibly just made herself an exile from her own culture. Behind her, the camp had fallen silent, everyone staring at the white woman who'd just defended them against her own people. Peter's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever seen," he said quietly. "Probably both," Alice replied, and found herself laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that she couldn't quite control. "Definitely both." Dakota turned his horse to face her, and for the first time since they'd met, Alice saw something in his hard face that looked almost like respect. He spoke in Comanche, his tone formal, and though Alice didn't understand all the words, she caught enough to grasp the meaning. Peter translated anyway, his voice colored with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. He says, "You have proven your loyalty beyond doubt." He says you are no longer a guest under sufferance, but Taibo Bavi, white friend, and that any who harm you, harm the whole band. He says your month is ended, your debt paid, but you are welcome to stay as long as you wish. Peter paused, then added softly, "He says you have more courage than most warriors he has known, and that he was wrong about you." From a man like Dakota, Alice understood. That was as close to an apology as anyone would ever hear. She met his eyes and nodded, accepting the tribute and the transformation it represented. Around them, the camp slowly came back to life. Children emerging from teepees, women returning to their interrupted work, warriors lowering their weapons. But everything had changed. Alice could feel it in the way people looked at her now, in the subtle shift from hostility to curiosity, from rejection to cautious acceptance. That night, for the first time since arriving in the camp, Alice was invited to share a meal at a communal fire with several families. The conversation flowed around her in Comanche she couldn't fully follow, but the gestures were universal. Passing food, making space for her to sit, even a few tentative smiles. Ayana sat beside her and, through a combination of simple English, gestures, and Peter's translations, they had something that resembled an actual conversation. The young widow who'd woken Alice so harshly that first morning actually laughed at something Alice said, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. As Alice lay in her teepee that night, exhausted but strangely content, she realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. She'd come here expecting to count down the days until she could return to her cabin and her old life. But now, halfway through her stay, she found herself not wanting to leave. Found herself curious about these people, their stories, their struggles, their way of life that was so different from everything she'd known. Found herself caring about what happened to them in ways that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago, and found herself thinking more and more about a Comanche warrior with amber eyes who'd taught her to see the world in a completely different way, and wondering what it meant that her heart beat faster every time he smiled at her. The final 2 weeks of Alice's month in the Comanche camp passed like water through her fingers, too fast, too precious, and impossible to hold on to no matter how tightly she tried to grasp them. After the confrontation with Daniel Morrison and his militia, Alice's status in the camp transformed completely. Women who'd barely acknowledged her existence now sought her out, teaching her their crafts with patience she hadn't expected. Mappy showed her how to create intricate beadwork patterns that told stories in color and design. The young widow, whose name Alice learned was Kimmy Mila, taught her how to make pemmican that would last through the hardest winters. Nakai herself took Alice under her wing, sharing knowledge of medicinal plants that grew on the plains. Some Alice recognized from her father's teachings, others completely new to her. But it was the evenings with Petar that Alice treasured most. They'd fallen into a routine. After the day's work was done and the communal meals finished, Peter would come to her teepee and they'd sit by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. He told her stories of his childhood, of learning to ride before he could properly walk, of his first buffalo hunt when he was 12 and had fallen off his horse in front of the entire hunting party. She told him about growing up on the frontier, about her mother's gentle hands and her father's quiet wisdom, about the loneliness that had defined her life since they'd both died. "I used to think I was strong because I could survive alone," Alice said one night while they worked together, "to repair a tear in one of her teepee's hides. But now I think maybe I was just scared. Easier to be alone than to risk caring about people who might leave." Peter's hands stilled on the sinew he was threading through the hide. "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now I think I was a fool," Alice admitted, not quite brave enough to look at him. "And there's strength in connection, too, in letting people matter to you, even when it's terrifying, maybe especially when it's terrifying." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words, with feelings neither of them seemed ready to name. Finally, Peter said, "When your month is finished, when you return to your wooden lodge, you will be alone again." It wasn't a question, but Alice answered anyway. "I suppose I will." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Unless I'm not." Something flickered in Peter's amber gaze. Hope, fear, longing, all mixed together. "What are you saying, Alice?" Before she could answer, before she could put into words the impossible thing that had been growing in her heart, Ayana burst into the teepee with tear-streaked cheeks and panic in her eyes. She spoke in rapid Comanche, gesturing wildly, and Peter went rigid beside Alice. He stood in one fluid motion, his expression transforming from tender to warrior hard in a heartbeat. "What is it?" Alice demanded, standing as well. "What's wrong?" "Kohana," Peter said tightly. "He went out hunting with 2 other young warriors this morning. They should have returned hours ago. Ayana just spoke with one of the scouts. There are signs of a fight near the canyon 5 miles south. Blood in the snow. Empty shell casings. White men's horses." His hands clenched into fists. "Takoda is gathering a war party. I must go." Alice's stomach dropped like a stone. Kohana, the young warrior who'd been kind to her from the first day, who'd smiled shyly and tried to learn English words, who couldn't have been more than 17 summers. "Let me come with you," she heard herself say. "No," Peter said immediately. "This could be dangerous. If white men have taken our warriors, there will be fighting." "All the more reason to bring someone who can speak English," Alice argued. "Someone who might be able to negotiate before the shooting starts. Peter, please, I can help." She saw the refusal forming on his lips, saw him preparing to leave her behind where it was safe. But then Ayana spoke again, her voice desperate, and something in her words made Peter pause. He looked between his sister and Alice, clearly torn. "Ayana says Kohana is her betrothed," he said finally. "They were to marry in the spring. She asks if you would truly help save him, or if your words about connection and caring were just empty sounds." The translation was blunt, but Alice heard the real question underneath. Would she risk herself for these people who'd become more than just strangers? Would she prove that the bridge she'd been building between their worlds was real and strong? "Enough to stand on?" "I'll help," Alice said without hesitation. "However I can. Just let me come." Peter studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Get your warmest clothes. We leave in 10 minutes." The war party rode hard through the winter night, Takoda in the lead. Peter at his side, Alice mounted on the same gentle mare she'd ridden into camp, and 15 other warriors whose faces were painted for battle and whose eyes held the cold fury of men preparing to fight. They covered the 5 miles in less than an hour, pushing their horses to the limit, and when they reached the canyon Takoda had mentioned, the scene that greeted them made Alice's blood run cold. Signs of struggle were everywhere: churned snow, broken arrows, dark stains that could only be blood. One of the young warrior's horses stood nearby, riderless and trembling, a bullet graze visible on its flank. But there were no bodies, no warriors, nothing except tracks leading east. Multiple horses, some of them clearly carrying double weight. Takoda examined the scene with eyes that missed nothing, speaking in low tones to his warriors. Peter translated for Alice. 3 of our young men were ambushed here. They fought but were outnumbered, maybe 8 or 10 white men. From the tracks, at least 2 of our warriors are wounded, possibly all 3. They've been taken alive, probably to the fort at Sullivan's Ridge. His voice was tight with controlled rage. They will be hanged as raiders, or shot trying to escape. Either way, they will be dead by morning unless we can reach them first. Sullivan's Ridge is 20 miles east, Alice said, her mind racing. There's a garrison there, maybe 40 soldiers, maybe more. You can't just attack a military fort, Peter. It would be suicide. Then our young warriors die, Takoda said in his rough English, his face carved from stone. We do not abandon our own. Alice understood the impossible position they were in. An attack on the fort would end in slaughter. The Comanche warriors were brave and skilled, but they'd be outnumbered and outgunned. But doing nothing meant watching 3 young men, including gentle Kohana, who'd offered her water and smiled shyly, die for the crime of being Comanche in their own ancestral lands. There might be another way, Alice said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke. Let me go in first, alone. I'm white, I speak English, and I'm known in the area. My father traded at that fort for years. I can tell them the warriors they captured were hunting on land that's been recognized as Comanche territory in the last treaty. I can argue that they haven't committed any crime, that taking them was unlawful. Maybe I can convince them to release the prisoners before this turns into a bloodbath. Every warrior turned to stare at her like she'd lost her mind. Takoda said something sharp in Comanche that needed no translation. It was clearly a refusal. But Peter held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. It could work, he said slowly. White soldiers might listen to a white woman where they would only shoot at us. And if Al-Is can buy us time, get them to hesitate, we can position ourselves around the fort. If negotiation fails, we strike before they can harm our people. He turned to Takoda, speaking rapidly in Comanche, making his case. The war chief's expression was skeptical, but he listened. The argument went on for several minutes, voices rising and falling in intensity. Finally, Takoda made a cutting gesture and spoke what was clearly a decision. Peter turned to Alice, his face grave. Takoda agrees to try your way, but with conditions. You ride in alone, but we will be watching from the ridges surrounding the fort. You have until dawn, about 4 hours. If our warriors are not released by then, or if the soldiers harm you, we attack. Many will die on both sides, but we will not leave without our own. He paused, reaching out to grip her shoulder. Alice, you do not have to do this. It is not your fight. No one would blame you if you refused. Yes, they would, Alice said softly. I would blame me. These people have become my people too, Peter. Maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm going to get killed, but I have to try. She met his eyes. Besides, someone once told me that when you save a person's life, you become bound to them. That connection lasts. Well, you saved me too. Saved me from loneliness, from seeing the world in only one way, from living a half-life of fear and isolation. This is how I pay that debt. Peter's expression did something complicated that made Alice's heart clench in her chest. For a moment, she thought he might pull her into his arms, might finally speak the words that had been building between them for weeks. But they were surrounded by warriors, preparing for possible battle, and this was not the time. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Then ride swift and speak well, and know that if anything happens to you, I will burn that fort to the ground with everyone in it." The threat should have frightened her. Instead, Alice found it strangely comforting. She rode the final miles to Sullivan's Ridge alone, her heart pounding so hard she felt lightheaded, rehearsing what she'd say over and over in her mind. The fort loomed out of the darkness as she approached, a wooden stockade with watchtowers at each corner, lanterns burning yellow in the windows of the buildings inside. As she got closer, a voice called out from the wall, "Halt! Identify! Yourself, or we shoot!" "Alice Kimball," she called back, keeping her hands visible and away from any weapons. "Daughter of Thomas Kimball. I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately. It's urgent." There was a pause, then the sound of voices conferring. Finally, the heavy gate creaked open just wide enough for her to ride through, and she found herself surrounded by soldiers with rifles pointed at her chest. A grizzled sergeant with whiskey on his breath grabbed her horse's bridle. "Alice Kimball, Thomas's girl. What in blazes are you doing out here in the middle of the night? And alone?" "I need to see Captain Hendricks," Alice said, recognizing the sergeant as one of her father's old trading partners. "Now, Sam, it's literally a matter of life and death." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because he nodded and gestured for two soldiers to escort her. They led her across the fort's muddy yard to a building that served as both headquarters and the captain's quarters. Inside, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes looked up from a desk covered in paperwork, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise when he saw Alice. "Miss Kimball, this is unexpected. Please sit down. What brings you to the fort at this hour?" Alice remained standing. "You have 3 Comanche prisoners here, Captain. Young warriors brought in tonight. I'm here to negotiate their release." The captain's expression hardened immediately. "Those aren't prisoners, Miss Kimball. They're raiders captured in the act of hostile action against white settlers. They'll be tried by military tribunal in the morning and hanged by evening." "They're hunters," Alice said firmly. "Captured on land that was designated Comanche territory in the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek. They committed no hostile action. Your soldiers ambushed them without provocation. This is an unlawful detention, Captain, and if those young men aren't released, you're going to start a war that'll cost dozens of lives on both sides." Captain Hendricks stood, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "With all due respect, Miss Kimball, you don't know what you're talking about. These savages and our people," Alice interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass, "with families and futures and the same right to live as you or me. And they're not alone out there, Captain. There's a Comanche war party positioned in the hills around this fort right now, 15 warriors, led by Takoda himself. You know that name, I assume? The war chief who burned Fort Richardson to the ground 3 years ago?" She saw the captain's face pale and pressed her advantage. "They gave me until dawn to secure the release of their people. If I fail, they attack. You're 40 soldiers against some of the finest warriors on the southern plains, and everyone in this fort dies. Is that really how you want this night to end?" The captain sank back into his chair, his face ashen. "You're working with them? Helping them?" "I'm trying to prevent a massacre," Alice said. "I've been living with Takoda's band for the past month. I've gotten to know these people, learned their language, their customs. They're not mindless killers, Captain. They're fighting for their survival, for the right to exist on lands that belonged to their ancestors long before any white man set foot here. Those 3 young warriors you captured. One of them is named Kohana. He's 17 years old. He likes to laugh, and he's kind to children, and he's going to marry a girl named Ayana in the spring. Does that sound like a savage who deserves to hang?" Captain Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. "Even if I wanted to release them, and I'm not saying I do, I don't have the authority. They were captured by Lieutenant Morrison and his civilian volunteers. He's claiming jurisdiction as the ranking officer present during their capture." Alice felt her stomach drop. "Daniel Morrison is here." "It arrived an hour ago with the prisoners. He's in the barracks now, celebrating with his men." The captain's expression was troubled. "Miss Kimball, I don't know what your relationship with Lieutenant Morrison is, but he's been telling everyone who'll listen that you've been taken captive by the Comanche and held against your will. He organized the civilian militia specifically to mount a rescue operation for you. Of course he had. Daniel Morrison had never been able to accept rejection, and now he'd twisted her choice to stay with the Comanche into a captivity narrative that justified his own violent prejudices. "Then you need to take me to him," Alice said, "because I'm going to set him straight once and for all." The confrontation happened in the fort's main barracks, with Daniel's militia and a dozen soldiers as witnesses. Daniel's face went through a complex series of emotions when Alice walked in. Surprise, relief, confusion, and finally anger when she began to speak. "I was never your captive, Daniel," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been a guest of Takoda's band for the past month, learning their ways, working alongside their women, earning their trust and friendship. The young warriors you ambushed and dragged here in chains? They're guilty of nothing except existing while Comanche, and if you don't release them right now, you're going to trigger a war that'll get everyone in this fort killed." Daniel's face flushed red with rage. "You're defending them? After what they've done? After they've killed and raided and destroyed? After white settlers stole their land, slaughtered their buffalo, broke every treaty we ever signed with them, and tried to erase them from existence?" Alice shot back. "Yes, Daniel, I'm defending them. Because I've seen the other side of this war now, and it's not as simple as good white settlers versus savage Indians. It's people fighting for survival on both sides, and it has to stop somewhere. Let it stop here. Let it stop tonight. Release those prisoners." "Never," Daniel spat. "Those red devils hang at dawn, and if their war party wants to attack, let them come. We'll kill every last one of them, and maybe finally have some peace around here." Alice turned to Captain Hendricks, who'd followed her into the barracks. "Captain, you have the authority to overrule him. You're the ranking military officer at this installation. Daniel and his civilian volunteers answer to you. Order him to release the prisoners." The captain looked between Alice and Daniel, clearly torn. The easy choice was to side with Daniel, to let the hangings proceed and deal with whatever consequences came. But Alice could see him calculating, weighing the cost of the coming battle against the political risk of releasing captured Comanche warriors. "The young lady makes a compelling argument," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "And I'm not eager to see this fort turned into a battleground if it can be avoided. Lieutenant Morrison, you will release the prisoners to Miss Kimball's custody immediately." Daniel looked like he'd been slapped. "You can't be serious. She's clearly been influenced by her captors, Stockholm Syndrome or some such. She doesn't know what she's saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Alice said coldly. "And I'm saying, if you don't release those warriors right now, you're condemning everyone here to death. Is your pride really worth that much?" The standoff lasted another tense minute before Captain Hendricks made the decision for him. He ordered 2 soldiers to bring the prisoners from the holding cell, and minutes later, Kohana and his 2 companions were led out, bruised, bloody, but alive. When Kohana saw Alice, his eyes widened with shock and something that might have been hope. Alice approached him slowly, aware of all the weapons still trained in their direction. "I'm taking you home," she said in careful Comanche, using the words Peter had taught her. "Your people wait. We go now." The ride out of Sullivan's Ridge with the 3 freed warriors was the longest of Alice's life. She half expected Daniel or one of his militia to shoot them in the back as they passed through the fort's gates. But Captain Hendricks kept his word, holding his men back, and soon they were riding north through the darkness toward the ridges where Takoda's war party waited. When they crested the rise, and Alice saw Petar riding toward them with the other warriors, relief hit her so powerfully she nearly fell from her horse. He reached her in seconds, his eyes scanning her face and body for injuries, his hands gripping her arms like he was afraid she might disappear. "You did it," he said, and his voice was rough with emotions he didn't even try to hide. "You walked into that fort alone and brought our people out alive. Alice, you are the bravest person I have ever known." Behind them, Kohana was being embraced by Takoda and the other warriors, all of them speaking at once, checking his wounds, clearly overjoyed to have him back. But Alice only had eyes for Peter, for the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and rare. "I couldn't let them die," she said simply. "Not when I could do something to stop it." "You have given us a great gift tonight," Dakota said, riding up beside them. His stern face was softened by something that might have been gratitude. "You have proven that peace between our peoples is possible if both sides are willing to see each other as human. This will not be forgotten, Alice Kimball." The journey back to camp felt different, lighter somehow, despite the exhaustion that made Alice sway in her saddle. When they arrived just after dawn, the entire band poured out to greet them, and Alice found herself pulled into embraces by women who'd been strangers a month ago, but now felt like family. Ayana clung to Kahana, weeping with relief, and even Nakai smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed her severe face. That evening, Dakota called the entire band together for what Petar explained was a special council. Alice sat beside him around the great central fire, while Dakota spoke in formal Comanche, his words carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. When he finished, Petar translated quietly. "He says your month is long finished, your debt more than paid. He says you have shown courage beyond what anyone expected, that you have risked your life for our people and asked nothing in return. He says you are welcome to stay among us as long as you wish, to make your home here if you choose, and that anyone who speaks against you speaks against him." Petar paused, then added softly, "He says you are no longer Taibobavi, white friend. You are simply Bavi, one of us." The words hit Alice with unexpected force, bringing tears to her eyes. She'd come here a month ago as a prisoner, expecting to count down the days until she could return to her lonely cabin. Instead, she'd found community, purpose, belonging, things she hadn't even realized she'd been missing until she had them. Later that night, after the celebrations had died down and people had retired to their tippies, Alice and Petar sat alone by her fire. The question that had been hanging between them for weeks finally demanded to be asked. "What happens now?" Alice said quietly. "I have a cabin, a homestead, my father's land, but I also have this, all of this." She gestured around the tipi but meant something larger. "I don't know how to choose between them." "Maybe you do not have to choose," Petar said. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold night air. "Our people are not tied to one place. We move with the seasons, following the buffalo and the good weather. In summer we could camp near your wooden lodge, help you work your land. In winter we could travel to warmer places, and you could come with us. Both worlds, Alice, not one or the other." It was an impossible dream, a way of life that existed in the space between two cultures, belonging fully to neither, but taking the best of both. Alice knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and dangers from people on both sides who couldn't accept such blending. But sitting there beside Petar with the fire crackling between them and the weight of everything they'd been through, settling into something that felt like forever, Alice found she didn't care about easy. "There's something else," Petar said. And now his voice held a tremor she'd never heard before. "Among my people, when a man wishes to marry, he must prove himself worthy, bring horses to the woman's family, demonstrate that he can provide and protect. I have no horses to offer you, Alice, because you have no family here to receive them. But I offer you myself, my strength, my protection, my loyalty, for as long as we both live. I offer you a life that will not be simple or safe, but will never be lonely. I offer you my heart, if you will have it." Alice felt like she couldn't breathe, like the whole world had narrowed down to this moment and this choice. A month ago, she would have said such a thing was impossible, a white woman and a Comanche warrior, bound together across a divide that most people thought insurmountable. But that was before she'd learned that people were just people, regardless of which side of an arbitrary line they were born on. Before she'd discovered that home wasn't a place but the people who made you feel like you belonged. "Yes," she said, the word coming out choked with tears and laughter and a joy so profound it hurt. "Yes, I'll have it. I'll have you. I'll have all of it, Petar. The impossible. Complicated, dangerous, beautiful, all of it. When he kissed her, it tasted like smoke and freedom, and the future unfolding in ways neither of their peoples could have predicted. And when they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Alice knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. She'd come to the frontier as a girl, looking for a place to belong. She'd found it in the last place anyone would have expected, in the arms of a man from a different world, among people who'd been taught to hate her, in a life that existed in the space between two cultures. It wouldn't be easy. There would be those on both sides who would never accept them, who would see their union as betrayal or weakness or worse. But as Alice Kimball looked into Peter's amber eyes and saw her own future reflected there, she knew that love, real love, the kind that crossed boundaries and built bridges and refused to be limited by fear, was always worth fighting for. And they would fight together for as long as it took to build a world where their choice didn't have to be impossible, where people from different worlds could come together without it being a tragedy or a scandal, where the color of your skin or the language you spoke mattered less than the content of your character and the courage of your heart. It was a long fight ahead. But Alice Kimball had never backed down from a challenge in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.